New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders. Its directors and employees assume no responsibility for the accuracy, completeness, objectivity, or usefulness of the information presented on our site. We do not endorse any recommendation or opinion made by any member or physician, nor do we advocate any treatment. You are responsible for your own medical decisions. Now I'm going to turn over the introduction of our speaker to Martha Butterfield, the Program Coordinator of NJCTS. Marty?
Kelly, thank you, and hi everyone and welcome. Before I introduce tonight's presenter, I'd like to share with you a couple of things that we're particularly excited about. First, if you didn't notice it on the slides, I just want to let you know that our website is now mobile friendly and accessible on any smartphone. Next, I'd like to draw your attention to the slide on the screen. On November 3rd in Mendham, New Jersey, we are holding our third annual Walk for TS. For those of you in and around New Jersey, please join us on the 3rd, form a team, and walk or run with us. We also need volunteers to help with the lead up to the event as well as the day of the event. If you can't join us that day, please log on to our website and make a donation in support of services we offer, such as tonight's webinar on educational rights for your child. Now I'd like to introduce tonight's presenter, Sue Connors. This is Sue's second appearance in our Wednesday webinar schedule this year, and I'm delighted to tell you that it won't be her last. Her previous presentation in April on tips for TS in the classroom is available for free download on our website. Sue's presentation tonight is part one in an educational series. Tonight she'll speak about educational rights, and next Wednesday, the 22nd, she'll discuss disciplining a child with neurological issues, as well as what options a parent has when educational services for their child are denied. If you have not registered for next week's webinar, I urge you not to miss it. Between tonight and next week, Sue will be offering a lot of great, helpful information that can level the playing field for parents who might be overwhelmed or confused about how best to secure educational services for their child. The New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome has known Sue for many years. She's had a long career in education and advocacy, working with children and families living with Tourette. Sue, now a retired middle school teacher from upstate New York, has more than 33 years of classroom experience. She served many years on the board of directors for the National Tourette Syndrome Association and was founder and chair of their education committee. While at National TSA, she worked as their education specialist. In that capacity, she has traveled extensively in the U.S. and Puerto Rico, as well as many other countries around the world, consulting and presenting workshops on Tourette syndrome. Sue has won numerous local, state, and national awards for her work in this field. She's consulted with and made appearances on a number of television programs featuring information on Tourette. She has published numerous articles, brochures, videos, and book chapters on the education of children with Tourette, and recently published her first book entitled The Tourette Syndrome and OCD Checklist, a practical reference for parents and educators. When it comes to information and a discussion about Tourette, Sue knows what she's talking about because she has Tourette herself, as do other members of her family. Sue, welcome. We are delighted to have you back. So without further introduction, I'm going to turn tonight's presentation over to you.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be back again. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to get right into the topic because there seems to always be so much information and so many questions on this particular issue about your child's rights, what they're entitled to, what you need to be asking for, what you need to be looking for. It's interesting because when I put the PowerPoint together for this, you know, the first thing that came to my mind that I needed to have up on the screen is what I have in front of you right now. It's something that happened actually in 2004, but was actually enacted officially in 2007. And it was the year that Tourette syndrome was finally officially listed as a disability in federal education law. And it's hard to believe that up to that point we had never been officially listed, but we hadn't, and it had created all kinds of problems for parents trying to get services for their children. And I've listed that law. It's always nice to have a copy of the law with you when you're going into a school system and asking for services, and they can see that you've done your homework. And the law states, we believe that Tourette syndrome is commonly misunderstood to be a behavioral or emotional condition rather than a neurological condition. Therefore, including Tourette syndrome in the definition of other health impaired may help correct the misconception of Tourette syndrome as a behavioral or conduct disorder and prevent the misdiagnosis of their needs. Up to this point, and you know, that was just 5 years ago, so I've been advocating for kids with Tourette for 25, 26 years, so I had many years of you know, working in schools for kids on behalf of kids with Tourette without this law in place. And I can tell you the problems that traditionally happened. Either the child did not qualify, you know, as many of you know, when a child gets services at school, they have to be put into a particular classification, and the classifications range from learning disabled, the autistic classification, you know, and one of the main ones is other health impaired. We have emotionally disturbed. And for years, we were denied services because the kids did not fit. They did not qualify under the learning disabled category if they didn't have a bona fide learning disability. The only other category that they ever wanted to put them in was emotionally disturbed, which is, again, not very appropriate, not at all appropriate. So by actually making sure that Tourette was, first of all, officially listed as a disability, and secondly, listed where it belongs as a health impairment, made all the advocates' jobs so much easier, and all the parents, you know, were delighted that they now had kind of something to hang their hat on. So I thought it would be important to start the whole presentation with this, you know, wonderful, you know, law that came into place federally back in 2007. Now, I think one of the things that, you know, and some of this may be a review for some of you, but a lot of people still, you know, wonder what are their options. You know, if your child is struggling in school, having some issues, what are my options? Well, basically, we have two federal laws that govern services for children in school. And one of them is one that you're probably more familiar with. It's called the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that's been around since 1973. And it basically applies to anyone with a disability. But there is a particular section of that law that is called Section 504, and that section is the one that prohibits discrimination in an education setting. And so, therefore, because that's the section, I mean, the ADA applies to, you know, public buildings, you know, things like wheelchair ramps. It applies to accommodations for people in employment situations. You know, it's across the field, the ADA is. But the section of that deals with children's educational issues is Section 504. And so, therefore, they have put together what we call a 504 accommodation plan, which is named after that particular section of the ADA. And basically what that does is it levels the playing field. You know, if you were a student with a hearing impairment, leveling the playing field would be, you know, letting you wear your hearing aids and sitting up close to the front of the room, or maybe having a sign language interpreter or whatever. So it's leveling the playing field for students with disabilities by providing accommodations through this 504 plan. It's you know, prohibits discrimination based on any disability in programs or activities that receive federal financial assistance. So that's your first option. Okay, now talk about which one is appropriate for which children and how do you decide and where do you go from here. The second federal law is called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the IDEA, which has also been around for many, many years. And that is a law that provides an individualized education plan, not just some accommodations for that child, but an individualized education plan, and we all know that as an IEP. And what that does is it provides accommodations, but it also provides direct services of either a special education teacher, an outside service provider, an occupational therapist, speech, counseling, all, you know, any kind of other special services. So the 504 is just accommodations, and we'll talk about what those could be, whereas the IEP is accommodations plus some direct services provided. So obviously the IEP is a better thing to have. It provides more than just some accommodations. There's more accountability with an IEP. Someone is actually in charge of that IEP, and usually that's the special education teacher. So there's, there are definitely benefits to having an IEP. Now, how does your child qualify for this? Not all children with Tourette syndrome will be eligible for special education in an IEP. Some will merely require modifications or accommodations through a 504 plan. Some will require even a higher level of services through the IEP. Now, I have to tell you that many times schools first refuse the IEP. That happens, and it seems to be happening more and more frequently, sadly, and I'm 100% sure that a lot of it has to do with economic times, and the education budget is always the first one to get cut no matter where you are. But I always tell parents the best thing to do is, if you are refused an IEP, accept the 504 plan to at least get some accommodations for your child. And if you find out that plan is not sufficient, it's not really improving your child's work, your child's social emotional issues, whatever the issue is, then you have more rationale to go back and insist on an IEP. One of the things that I often do is when they refuse an IEP and we get just a 504 plan, I purposely, kind of load the 504 plan with accommodations. And they're not things that I'm just making up, they're things that the child needs. But, they quickly find out that a regular education teacher in a regular classroom cannot possibly provide all those accommodations. They need some outside assistance. So the 504 is not necessarily going to be enough. Whoops. Now, how do you know that your child needs services? That's a question I get a lot from parents. Well, there are a lot of red flags to look for. Obviously, a decline in grades is a huge red flag. Increased frustration. If your child is coming home and having meltdowns over homework, they seem to be very frustrated with not being able to keep up with their work. A decrease in the child's self-esteem is often a real red flag also. Any kind of social difficulties. Social difficulties can sometimes be as debilitating in a school setting as the lack of performance, the decline in grades. A sudden negative attitude about school, the child who doesn't want to go to school anymore for whatever reason. Something's going on, they're not being successful. School avoidance, school phobia. Behavioral issues that are suddenly starting to creep into the picture where your child never had these issues before. If a child is bored and not doing well, then they are going to become a behavioral issue. If they have no self-esteem, they're going to become a behavioral issue. If you see an increase in tic symptoms or Tourette syndromes due to the stress and anxiety, difficulties at home that appear to be a direct result of school issues. Like I said, a child coming home and hasn't accomplished a whole lot during the day, and so they have more homework that's taking them a lot longer than everyone else, and you're having these, evenings that are lasting 4 and 5 hours, and crying at the table and everybody working with the child. I mean, all of these things are red flags that something is not working well in that school setting. Your child must very likely need some extra supports. Now, when I talked about the 504 plan, just being accommodations, I mean, IEP has accommodations also, but some of the things, because a lot of people don't really know what to put on a possible accommodation plan. And I'm certainly glad to provide you with a brochure that I actually, wrote called Catalog of Accommodations that takes you through Tourette and all the associated disorders, just to kind of give you some ideas, but for some examples. For example, extended time on a test. A lot of our kids, when there's a time frame given that brings the stress level up, and when the stress level is brought up, then immediately everything else falls apart. The tics get worse, the OCD gets worse, and if you just say to them, you don't really have the same time frame as everybody else. You can have double time, you can have time and a half. Immediately just reduces the stress, and very frequently the child won't even take any more time than they normally would because the stress is reduced. I was in I did a workshop this morning for some school nurses, and I did an experiential exercise that I very frequently do when I present to any educational personnel. I give them a written task to perform. Usually I have them write the pledge to the flag, and while they're doing that, I set a time limit of 1.5 minutes, and I give them 1 tic and 1 obsession. And the minute they're doing okay, and they're not too nervous about this until I put that time frame in place. And once they know that the clock is ticking, and I'm telling them every few minutes you have 35 seconds left, you have 20 seconds left, and the tick gets worse, and no one in all the many times I've done this has ever completed it. And they start realizing the kind of accommodations that these kids really do need and how this impacts. Testing in a separate location, so kids who are very distractible. Also, it's very good for kids who might have vocal tics, whether they be particularly loud or not. They're embarrassed by the vocal tics. The classroom in a testing situation is quiet, so they try really hard not to do their tics. And the more they hold it in, the less they can concentrate. If they're in a room by themselves, not a big deal. Extra set of textbooks at home for those children who have organizational problems, which is, many of our kids. Preferential seating, so they're up front so they can pay attention but not center. Putting a child with Tourette in the center front of the classroom is just devastating. I mean, they feel like every tick they have, the whole class is watching. Access to a computer. That's something you can, in a lot of schools, will even provide the computer for them. I have schools who frequently will provide a laptop for a child to use in school for long written assignments, for taking notes because of their handwriting issues. One of the things you can put in the IEP and the 504 plan, and a lot of people don't realize you can actually put this in that plan, is a mandatory in-service on Tourette for all staff working with that child. That is something that the IDEA supports, and I'll give you the section of the law in a couple of minutes that talks about that. And once it's on their 504 plan or IEP, then every year that's mandated. And you could even say it has to be done within the first 2 weeks of school. So, the kid isn't starting the school year with, all of these tics and everything else going on, and nobody knows what the problem is. An extra locker to assist with organization. A scribe for kids with, the handwriting issues, especially the younger children who aren't really good at typing yet. Books on tape for kids who have, tics that interfere with reading. These are just, a few suggestions, and there are many more in the catalog of accommodations, which I'm more than happy to send you if you email me. I'll explain how you can do that later. Now, what are some examples? And again, sometimes it's hard when parents are sitting in a meeting. The teachers will say often, and I know this from having been a teacher for many years, they don't always see everything that's going on with that child. And the reason is that they have a class of 25 or 30 kids in front of them. They can't be focusing on that one child. And so many times they miss a lot of what's happening and interfering. So it's always nice to have specific examples of tics, obsessions that your child is dealing with at that time and how they may be interfering. And I just have a few examples. A student who has a head shaking tic that happens every few seconds interferes with their ability to stay focused on the exam or on a reading assignment. And it slows down the test-taking process. I met with a little guy yesterday. His mom is on our board, and I was at their house, and he was reading using his iPad. And I said to him, is it easier for you to read on the iPad? He said, it sure is. He said, if you notice, I have a lot of facial tics, and I blink my eyes, and I scrunch my eyes, and I roll my eyes. And he said, with the iPad, I can highlight exactly where I am on the page as I'm reading. So when my attention is taken away because I'm eye blinking, I know right exactly where I am when I come back to the page again. You can't do that in a book. And so, these are the kind of things. A teacher may not even notice that if they're not sitting watching that child. If a student has an eye blinking tic or other facial tics, it may, as I said, be difficult to keep their place and slows down the reading or test taking. A lot of our kids have difficulty with anything that requires transferring an answer to a separate sheet, like a computer sheet where it has to be bubbled in. You can get on your child's plan that they are allowed to take the test right in the test booklet, and then somebody else will transfer the answers later. If a student has a tic that makes their wrist twist, then several times a minute, it's going to be impossible for them to hold a pencil and write fluidly. So you may have to have some writing accommodations in place. An obsession to count every word and every line that you read, it makes test taking very slow and laborious. And those are the kind of things that a lot of our kids go through. If they have ADHD, they're going to be distractible in a large room setting. They may need extra time and frequent breaks because of the vocal tics that interfere or the ADHD that causes them to be very fidgety. A student who has a loud screeching vocal tic will most likely interfere with other students' concentration during the test. So put them in a separate location. We talked about the bubbling, if they have to make sure the bubble is perfectly filled in. I've worked with kids, but that's why I have all these examples, because these are all examples of kids I have worked with. I worked with a little girl who took a social studies test with 25 questions. She finished the test in about 30 minutes, and 2 hours later she was still bubbling the computer sheet and crying while she was doing it because every bubble had to be perfectly filled in. And, I just finally said, would you please take that sheet away from her? Oh, my gosh. She's got the test done. She's had it done for, an hour. Just let somebody bubble that in for her or correct the test booklet. Those types of things. So these are just some examples. You go into the school, and these are the things you have to bring up to them to make them realize why they need these particular accommodations. I think one of the most important things I can say today, and I'll say it a couple of times in the course of the presentation, it's so important to remember that you, as a parent, if you are the parent, are an equal member of either the 504 or the IEP team. I think sometimes, I've gone into IEP meetings where the testing has been done, and as you walk in the door, they hand you the committee's decision that the child is not eligible for those services. And the meeting is supposed to be where that decision is made, because that's where all the facts are supposed to be presented, all the testing that has been done, the reports are discussed and gone over. We have a whole series of things that have to be gone over at that meeting. And for them to say before you walk in that the child is ineligible, I mean, you're a member of that team and you have not been consulted. So it's something always very, very important to remember when you go into these meetings. Other reasons, we talked about some of these, that kids may need services. We talked about the interfering tics, we talked about the obsessions and the compulsions that get in the way, but remember, Tourette is a spectrum. There is so much more to this disorder than tics. I mean, dysgraphia, handwriting difficulties are, just across the board, very, very prevalent with kids with Tourette. And, I always say to teachers, if you can't write, you're not going to succeed at school. It's as simple as that. Just about everything that you're graded on in school has got to be written. And if you can't write, then you're going to really struggle with school. And so you have to have some sort of handwriting accommodations. The attention issues can be a real problem. A lot of our kids have short-term memory deficits. They will have difficulty with anything that's fill in the blank. If you give them a word bank to pick from, they can pull that word out. They will have, but to fill in the blank, they're lost. They can sometimes have difficulty with things like remembering math facts. They can have, the 3 times tables down pat the night before, take the test and fail it because of the short-term memory deficits. A lot of kids with Tourette have social skills deficits, which don't always interfere with their actual academic performance, but they certainly do affect their social emotional well-being in a school setting. Processing deficits, where kids process things more slowly. The hyperactivity, if they don't have freedom, a little more freedom of movement, then they're going to have a really hard time sitting still and focusing. And I think one of the things that I find the most difficult to deal with and trying to get people to really get a grasp on, everybody, I'm not talking teachers here, I'm talking teachers, parents, everybody, is that executive dysfunction, which is the organizational difficulties that these kids have. And again, it's rampant with our kids to have difficulty with organization. They do their homework, they forget to turn it in. They do it, they leave it on the desk, and they don't remember that it's there, and they don't turn it in, and don't get a grade for it. They never write their homework down. They bring home the right book but the wrong folder. They come to class with the right book but the wrong folder. And this is something, if you don't turn your homework in, you don't get a grade on it, you're going to fail. It's as simple as that. So these are all reasons. I mean, you can go to a meeting and people, that you can be told that the tics are not interfering, but there's just so much more to Tourette than just the tics. The other thing that I think is so important is that to get services for these kids, it used to be that it had to impact their academic performance. That's no longer the case. It has to, it has to affect one or all of the following: performance, learning, social, emotional, behavior, and functioning. If you have a child who is academically doing okay, but socially, emotionally, and behaviorally is falling apart, that child probably needs some services. If they're not functioning in that school setting, whether it be academically or socially and emotionally, they still could qualify for services. It doesn't have to just impact educational performance anymore. Now, back to the Americans with Disabilities Act. In 2008, there were some amendments made to this in reference to educational issues, the 504 section. And this first new amendment emphasizes that the definition of a disability should be construed in the favor of broad coverage of individuals to the maximum extent permitted by the terms of the ADA, and generally shall not require extensive analysis. How much, how does it interfere? I've been at meetings where we sit there for 45 minutes discussing how, a particular thing, an eye blinking, interferes. We're looking at, just generally, how could it interfere? And sometimes these experiential exercises just solve the problem. Everybody try reading for the next 10 minutes and blinking your eyes nonstop. Okay, now do you get what I'm talking about? The effect of these changes is to make it easier for individuals seeking protection under the ADA to establish that he or she has a disability within the meaning of ADA. Another recent change, the 504 Act says that a disability used to say the disability had to substantially limit a major life activity. I'm sorry, it used to say that it had to significantly, which really was translated as of the utmost importance, impact them. But now it just states that it has to substantially, which means it actually does, it truly does limit some major life activity that schools are using. And it used to be significantly, but they've actually gone back on that a little bit. So it just has to be, it actually in some way limits a major life activity. Now, the other thing they did is the major life activities were listed, and they included things like performing, manual tasks, walking, speaking, learning, working. They have added things like reading, concentrating, thinking, communicating. The list of activities that this can affect has been broadened. And if you look at this list of the ones just that I have listed here, you can see where kids with Tourette, how this would impact at least one of these major life activities: performing manual tasks if they have dysgraphia, walking. I've had kids who have a really hard time like doing stairs because they have tics where they'll trip themselves. Learning, obviously, if you have a learning disability, concentrating if you have ADHD, reading, how do you read when your eyes are blinking and your head is jerking, communicating doesn't just mean verbal communication, it also means written communication. So you can see where there are many activities that are listed that, as long as it affects a major life activity and in one way, it doesn't have to be every major life activity, it has to affect only one, then you do qualify for that 504 plan. And the other thing is the new law now states that an impairment that is episodic or in remission is a disability if it would substantially limit major life activity when active. And that happens with kids with Tourette because the symptoms wax and wane. If the kid is having an exacerbation of symptoms in the fall, around January they start to really subside, so they're not as noticeable. It doesn't mean that you take the 504 plan away because it's not in remission, but it's episodic. An impairment, again, as I said, has to limit just one major life activity, and it's still considered a disability. And these are all things I put in here because I have gone to schools and they have said it doesn't limit a number of disabilities, it does a number of activities, it doesn't have to. Just one major life activity is enough. And again, a student who has difficulty with written communication may still qualify as having a disability even if they are doing well academically and it's not impacting learning. It doesn't have to, they don't have to be failing to get these services. Symptom management and mitigating measures. The student may still qualify for a 504 even when the symptoms are being managed by medication or if they're getting specific strategies or undocumented supports. I'm working with a little girl right now whose teacher last year was phenomenal. And she didn't have a 504, but the teacher, realizing that she really was struggling, gave all kinds of undocumented supports. Extended time on things, just, things that they were doing in the classroom, seating her in a particular place. And she really had a successful year because of it. But not every teacher is going to be willing to do that. And so, even though she was doing fairly well, because these were undocumented supports, we felt it necessary to put them into some sort of we asked the teacher to actually list the supports and the strategies she was using that she felt helping this child, and that's what got us the 504 plan. Many students are mistakenly denied eligibility because they have above average grades or high achievement assessment scores. Section 504 states, and this is the same thing for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that students can be found to be eligible regardless of their intelligence if the disability results in students being unable to fully demonstrate their ability. You know, if you're getting 80, high 70s, low 80s, and your IQ is 128, you are not fully demonstrating your abilities. And there's something going on that's interfering with that. So even though you're passing and getting from grade to grade, you're not failing, it has nothing to do with it. It has to simply, you know, it has to in some way impact them. So that's the ADA, and as I said, with the ADA, it's an easier thing to qualify for, but it will just provide accommodations. Just a list of things that hopefully will get passed around all the teachers, and everybody will take care of these accommodations. Unfortunately, with the 504 plan, they're not well monitored, and I know that from being a teacher. You know, sometimes I wouldn't even get a notice until the 3rd or 4th week of school that I had a child with a 504 plan. Well, all this time, I'm not providing that child with the accommodations, and there's nobody really in charge of that 504 plan because there's no outside service provider, you know, no special education teacher or OT or somebody who's going to actually monitor that teachers are being notified and it's being done. So then, you know, we have the second thing that I talked about was the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is, again, another federal law which provides for services for children through the IEP process, the Individualized Education Plan process. And the process of whether your child has a 504 and you're trying to move up to the next level to get them an IEP because the 504 is not working, or if you're just going in and asking for an IEP right off the bat, there's a process you have to follow. That child can be referred by the parents themselves, or the school district staff can also refer that child and request that they be evaluated. Once the parents request it, then the clock starts ticking, and I'll talk about what that means. After that, after they are you know, referred by the parent or a staff member, the evaluations must be completed, and I'll talk about the evaluations to ask for. The eligibility decision, once the testing is all done, will be made at what is called an IEP meeting. Now, every state calls IEP meetings something different. In New York State, where I live, they're called CSE meetings, Committee on Special Education. Other states, you know, call them something different. But it's basically a meeting, an IEP meeting to either put an IEP in place or review the IEP. And remember, this decision is not made in advance of that meeting. This is made at the meeting where all parties that are on that committee are there. Then they determine whether or not the child is eligible for services, and the fourth step is to develop the IEP, determine what services that child is going to get, and if any special placement has to be made. I think one of the most important things that you know, to remember when I was in school and even when I was first teaching many years ago, special education was a place. We could all remember in our schools where the special ed room was. And those were the kids that were, you know, the paper was over the windows and you were almost afraid to walk by that room. It was absolutely ridiculous. And now it's rare for a child to have a special placement when they have an IEP. They're in a regular classroom with regular kids. They just get services. They're mainstream with everyone else. So every now and then we'll find a child who has severe disabilities in a lot of different areas, and they have to be in a smaller classroom setting for a period of time. But that's fairly rare anymore. That really doesn't happen a lot. Now, I talked about the time frame. Once you submit that letter, and it really needs to be put in writing, and we'll talk about who that letter goes to. Don't just talk to the classroom teacher and say, I'd like to have him evaluated. That doesn't start the clock ticking. You know, you'll wait 6 months and then the teacher will have forgotten and you didn't put it in writing. You must put it in writing. And in most states, the school district then has 60 school days from the receipt of that request for evaluation to have completed all the necessary evaluations, scheduled the IEP meeting, and have a program in place for that child. Now, federal law actually says it has to be done in a reasonable amount of time, which is very, to me, very what I call loosey-goosey. But most states have actually nailed that down a little bit better and said 60 school days. And some states I've gone into have said 30 school days to have the evaluations done, and then a certain time after that to have scheduled the meeting. But I think, you know, I think 60 days, even by federal law, wording, 60 days is a reasonable amount of time. I have to be honest, a lot of schools don't take anywhere near that long, but that's what they have from the time you make the evaluation. Now, how do you need to know how you want how to evaluate that child? There's a section of IDEA 300.304C and C4 that talk about how this child should be assessed. And it states the child is assessed in all areas related to the suspected disability, including, if appropriate, health, vision, hearing, social emotional status, general intelligence, academic performance, communicative status, and motor abilities. So, we know that suspected disabilities with kids with Tourette are processing problems, handwriting issues, many times the social immaturity. So we can ask for specific tests to be done to test not just general school psychologists, school psych evaluations, but some more, extra tests to be done just to make sure that we're covering all areas of suspected disability. I talked earlier about how it's so important that you have on your child's 504 plan or IEP that the child's teachers will be in service at the beginning of every school year. And this is the section 601C5E of the IDEA. If you want to copy this and bring it into the school, they support high-quality, intensive pre-service preparation and professional development for all personnel who work with children with disabilities in order to ensure that such personnel have the skills and knowledge necessary to improve the academic achievement and functional performance of children with disabilities, including the use of scientifically based instructional practices to the maximum extent possible. So, if they're saying we can't do an in-service, we can't demand that our teachers do this, I have the answer to all of these. You can do it before school, you can do it after school. If the contract prohibits teachers from staying after school, asked to come into the monthly faculty meeting where they're all required to be there, asked to meet with teachers during their planning time during the day, bring, obviously somebody from your local Tourette Syndrome Association or somebody who knows something about the disorder to do an in-service, but you can request that. Now, the developing of the IEP and the review and the revisions. In developing a child's IEP, as I've said before, the team has to consider a lot of things, not just academics, but academic, developmental, and functional needs of the child. And those are all very specific things that the team has to include. And again, I'm going to reiterate the rules to follow. Always put your request in writing. And as I said before, I would tell you who this should go to. It should go to the Director of Special Education for the school district and or the school principal. I like the and better. Let's copy everybody on it. Special ed director, school principal, everybody gets it. Copy for your own file so that you know. And they should, within a very short amount of time, acknowledge to you that the receipt of your letter and give you a paper to sign that you agree to have your child evaluated. When you go to that first meeting, always try to bring someone from your local TSA, either chapter or agency, or an advocate from an outside advocacy agency, especially to that first meeting, because you have the right to, have somebody with you, and you also have the right to take that IEP or 504 plan home with you and have it reviewed before agreeing to it. Sometimes, dad can't come to the meeting because he's working. Sometimes you're by yourself and you want to take it home and have somebody else review it. Somebody who's a special ed teacher, somebody who is more knowledgeable, and obtain information through your local agencies. And don't ever assume that your child's teachers know little about Tourette and the accompanying disorders, and do your homework and be prepared to educate them about Tourette and the related disorders and the approach that is most effective for your child. Now, one of the things I put in here, and I'm not going to read through them all with you, I'll kind of go through them a little bit. I put in there a sample school letter. Sometimes parents sit down, they don't know what to say in this letter they write to the school district. And so here's a letter, okay, that you could just kind of fill in the blanks, put your own child's name into. My child has recently been diagnosed with Tourette by Dr. So-and-so. Tourette syndrome is a neurological spectrum disorder, and it's almost always accompanied by other neurological disorders. My child, therefore, has also been diagnosed and lists them: ADHD, OCD, whatever the child's been diagnosed with. I have anxiety. I have observed the impact that these disorders are having on his or her academic performance and social and emotional well-being. I've also learned from Tourette syndrome literature that a very large number of children with Tourette also exhibit learning disabilities, especially in nonverbal learning. These disabilities very often include sensory issues, processing, dysgraphia, difficulty with written language. I am therefore requesting that my child be observed and receive the complete psychoeducational evaluation by the school psychologist as the first step in seeking from the IEP team a classification of other health impaired. I'm also requesting evaluations in the following areas, and I'm going to list those evaluations in a second, that I suspect are also areas of deficit. Include a letter of diagnosis from the treating physician if you haven't provided that to your school already. And then, of course, say that you are happy to meet with school personnel at any point to discuss what's being exhibited in the classroom, give them some suggestions while this process is being followed. I think another equally important letter is a letter from the treating physician. There's nothing more powerful than a medical letter to bring into a meeting when you're asking for a classification of other health impaired. However, I also know that doctors, I don't know how to write medical letters. They don't know how to write education letters. And so I have put together a letter that a doctor could send, and I have never had a doctor who was insulted when I sent them this letter and asked them to follow this guideline when they write their letter. And it just basically talks about that the child has been under their care, diagnosed with whatever, how these disorders are having a negative impact, and have them be specific. The following tics, obsessions that he or she is exhibiting are interfering with his ability to read, write, complete assignments. The symptomology of ADHD is proving to impact negatively on their academic performance. They're unable to organize materials. They're distracted by external stimuli. Can't complete assignments on time, getting into trouble because of their impulsiveness and under great stress socially because of the nature of the tics. And it is my recommendation that a full battery of testing, school psychoeducational testing, be done. In addition, here are the other tests we very often ask for. Fine motor, visual motor. The OT, occupational therapist, will do that. Central auditory processing by the speech language person. Language processing, memory skills, executive function. The OT will also do sensory issues. Another thing that's important is to talk about the medications the child is taking and how they may impact. I think if you get a letter from a doctor, very specific like this, it's golden when you go into that meeting because you're asking for a classification of other health impaired. And as I said before, doctors are not insulted that you provide something like this to them because it really helps them. And here again is the list of evaluations to ask for. The OT eval for dysgraphia. The OT, again, would do the sensory, the executive functioning, the auditory processing. The assistive technology evaluation is something I have not mentioned. It's not really an evaluation of your child. It's once the child has been determined to have, whatever the issues they're having, it's a very good idea to ask that the district do an assistive technology evaluation to look for what technology they could introduce to help your child with these particular areas of deficits. And I'm talking about, the use of a computer. The child might need a device that reads to them because they're having trouble with interfering tics while they read. And the assistive technology person, either for the district, some school districts go to outside universities to have them done. Some go to local educational agencies and have them done, but they're really good. The last thing is the functional behavioral assessment. I'm not going to talk too much about this today because that's going to be a huge part of the presentation next Wednesday about the functional behavioral assessments. But if your child is having any behavior issues at school, it's something you are not only should request, but the district must do it. And again, I'm not going to go into detail now because it's something I'm going to deal with a lot next week. Now, what happens when you go to the meeting and they produce all of the results of all these evaluations and you don't agree with them? A parent has a right. Now, this is a law that has been in existence for a very long time, and it's always amazed me that it's there, but it is. If you do not agree with the evaluation, like the OT evaluated them for dysgraphia and didn't do maybe a long enough writing sample, and so they didn't really get to see how the writing deteriorates after a few sentences. You have the right to respectfully write a letter to the school disagreeing with that evaluation that was done by the school district, and then you have a right to have an outside independent evaluation at the school district's expense. All you have to do is write a letter saying, I disagree. I do not agree with your findings, and so I am seeking an outside independent educational evaluation, whether it be occupational therapy, speech language, whether it be a neuropsychological examination, and they have to pay for that. It's a very interesting rule. Law, it's been around for a long time, but I've seen it happen many, many, many times. We've talked a lot about the team. Who is on the IEP team? Now, some states have, different people. These are the key people that everyone has to have there. And if you're for example, in New York State, they add one person, which I'll tell you about. Other states may have another person added. It's important to go back and find out in your own state, but these people have to be there. There has to be the parent and the child where appropriate. A lot of times when kids are older, they do start coming to their IEP meetings. I think it's important. There has to be a regular ed teacher that's teaching that child, a special education teacher. If they already have an IEP, then they'd have their teacher for that year. If not, if they don't have an IEP, they've never been identified, any special ed teacher. There has to be another school representative. Sometimes it's the head of the committee. Sometimes it is the school principal. It varies by district. And they have to have a school psychologist, preferably the one who did the evaluations, or someone who can interpret the evaluations. Now, if they've had an occupational therapy evaluation, then you want that person there to interpret. If they've had a speech-language evaluation, you want that speech-language person there. And at the discretion of a parent or other agency, other individuals who have knowledge or special expertise regarding the child, including related services personnel as appropriate. You can bring someone to that meeting with you. You can bring an advocate. You can bring, if you're seeing an outside psychologist, you can bring that person with you. You can ask that your medical doctor be, if they can't attend in person, they can be on the telephone. All of these these IEP teams have, are supposed to have speakerphones. And if you just let them know in advance that someone can only be there by speakerphone, they have to allow for that. In New York, as I said, the one person they add what they call a parent rep. They have parents of kids with special needs from the district who are specially trained to be a parent rep on the team. In New York, you can what's the word? You can sign off on that if you're bringing someone else with you from an outside agency or an advocate. But the parent rep is there to really, represent the parent at the meeting when no one else is there to represent that parent. So it's a good idea to have them. I always, also with these kids, always ask that the school nurse be present because it's a medical condition and they will have particular knowledge about medications and things that the teachers may not have. Remember, I've said this before, you are an equal member of that team. They can't make decisions without you. A word to the wise, do not accept a refusal for classification based on the following reasons. Your child does not qualify as learning disabled. This doesn't apply because you are not asking your child be classified as LD, learning disabled. You're looking for OHI, other health impaired. Other disorders that qualify under other health impaired are things like asthma, diabetes, ADHD, epilepsy. They're all health conditions, and Tourette fits right in there, and therefore that's where they should be classified. The other thing we sometimes hear is your child does not qualify because he is receiving good grades or not failing. Federal law states that special education cannot be denied because the student is receiving passing grades and or progressing from grade to grade. Additionally, the law states that a student's developmental and functional progress must be taken into consideration in addition to academic performance. So you've got the answers if they come up with those reasons. Here is kind of a list of resources, okay? These are all brochures that I have written, and one of the things I'm going to give you at the end is my email address. If you want a copy of any of these, I have them on my computer. I can attach them to an email. Just email me. There's a brochure called Getting Help at School, Where Do I Begin? Some people think that's for the novice, you're just starting the process, but there's sometimes things in these simple beginning brochures that can help even the parent who's been going through this for a while. There's another one entitled The ABCs of Special Ed. One of the things that I know intimidates parents when they go into these meetings is that teachers speak in their own language. We talk about the IEPs and the CSEs and the 504s and the FBAs. And any parent, it's nice to have that little cheat sheet next to you with all these things defined. So if they start talking, and don't feel embarrassed to ask them to tell you what that means. but sometimes they're just whipping through it so fast. It's good to have done your homework so you know what they're talking about. I have a brochure that actually goes through a lot of what I'm going through tonight. It's called Section 504, the Americans with Disabilities Act, versus the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDEA. What's the difference? So it's just a way to go back and review all the differences. The one that I spoke about earlier, the Catalog of Accommodations, really good resource looking for accommodations for kids, and you may not even be able to think of things that could be done for that child. I tell teachers all the time that these children with this disorder are going to be some of the most challenging kids you work with, and one of the main reasons is because this is a disorder that changes all the time. The nature of the disorder means that it waxes and wanes, and so at any given day you could have a new obsession or a new tic that you've never ever had to deal with before, and sometimes unless you go through that catalog of accommodations and say, wait a minute, that might do for this one, it's hard. You always got to be thinking. You always have to be thinking outside the box. How can I accommodate that child? What can I do to help that child, maintain their self-esteem, function in the classroom? The Functional Behavioral Assessment Workbook, and again, next week I'll talk about that in detail. And there are also two brochures. One is Writing the IEP for Students with Tourette, a Parent's Guide, and Writing an IEP for Students with Tourette, a Teacher's Guide, that kind of takes you through a lot of what we talked about today. And I think that is vitally important that everybody kind of read that before you go in, so you kind of see what you're looking at. One other thing I want to mention, this will be the last thing we talk about, if you are dealing with a compliance issue, okay, I'm talking about a compliance issue means they're not complying with the proper procedures, conducting the meeting appropriately, breaking, the educational law. An example would be a meeting I went into, and I've talked about this a little bit earlier, where we sat down at the meeting, and I had actually driven 2 hours to be there with the parents, and as we walked in, they handed us all a packet. And I sat down and I got to the second page of the packet, and at the top of the page it says, the name of the student does not qualify for an IEP. They handed me that as I walked in the door. That is completely out of compliance. You cannot do that. You cannot make a decision in advance of the child doesn't qualify, because that's what the meeting is for. And so there in every state ed department there is a quality assurance office, and they have compliance officers that deal with every school district in that state. Some of them have 5 or 6 districts assigned to them depending on the size of the district. And so you can contact the special education department of your state, and if you're having trouble finding it, I will help you. Just email me, and you can find the quality assurance office and make a call or write a letter or do both to the compliance officer for your district, and they will immediately call that district and say, if you don't come into compliance by redoing this meeting or whatever, then state aid is gone. And no district wants to hear that. They act very swiftly, and they really get the job done, because I've had to do that a few times, and it really does work. As I said before, I have all of these brochures at my fingertips. If anybody wants them, a lot of them are on our chapter website, which I have given you the email address of, or the website address of. But if you could just email me at my email address, I'm more than happy to send you any of these as an attachment so you have it on your computer. I think we're just leaving just about enough time to start some questions if anybody is interested.
Well, Sue, as usual, you have jam-packed the the hour. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I want to hit a couple questions, though, right away. You were just talking about compliance. So
Yes.
does that compliance slide that you had up there, does that apply to both a 504 and an IEP, or is
Absolutely.
that really, okay, for both of them then?
For both of them. Because they can be out of compliance with a 504 as well as an IEP. They're both legal documents.
Okay. All right, good. Is there, you had another slide about who makes up the team for the IEP meeting. Is there a team for a 504, or is that structured differently? Like, who should the parent be expecting to sit across from in a 504 meeting?
At a 504 meeting, the team, it's not specifically designated by law. Every school district, or many times within a district, a particular school has a 504 team. It usually consists of a 504 coordinator, because every district has to have a 504 coordinator, and many times big districts will have one in each building. Very frequently the school principal is there, teachers working with that child. So it's very similar to the IEP team, but they will not have done evaluations, so you don't necessarily need a school psychologist. And if they're not being asked to be classified, then you won't need a special education teacher. So you have to ask in that particular building who is on the 504 team.
Okay, so the question that was, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to speak.
No, that's fine, that's fine.
Yeah. The question that was raised is, in this particular case, the school psychologist is going to start the process according to this mom,
Right.
and then that she would be the one in charge. And the parent is asking that should the parent then include the principal? So you wouldn't necessarily have to do that then. That would be the team that normally meets then for a 504, and it may already include the principal.
Exactly. And you can invite anyone you want to. Like I tell parents all the time, invite the school nurse, as I've said before. Invite the principal just to keep that person in the loop. I go to schools all the time for 504s, and it's very, very common that the principal sits in. They want to be on top of what's happening in their building, so they sit in on those meetings. They don't necessarily have to unless they're officially on that team for that school, but a parent can invite anyone to be at that meeting.
Okay, either from their side or from the school side then.
Exactly,
okay.
Exactly. There will be a team in place for the school, but they can invite anybody else they want and bring anybody they want.
Okay. When you have an accommodation for additional time, either in a 504 or an IEP, is that time on a test, is that time supposed to be given in a location other than the classroom, or if so, does the location need to be specifically spelled out?
I think, and this is something, I mean, it can be anywhere. If the child isn't finished, let's say they had a 20-minute test, everybody finished, and they have double time, so they have the rest of the class to take it. If they're sitting in the back of the classroom trying to take that test, the classroom is now getting not noisy, but there's, there are things going on. The teacher's teaching, the kids are answering. So I always suggest to parents that when they get extra time for a test, work out exactly where that's going to be. And that's why a lot of times if they have extra time, I tell them to also put special location. So then they're already in that special location, which is either the resource room or a lot of our kids get totally separate location. So they
so the test should hypothetically then begin and end in some place that's not part of the classroom.
Exactly.
I spoke with oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I sometimes go into meetings where they'll have extended time, but they don't have separate location. And that's where we have to sit down and say, okay, well, how's this going to work? After this test is done, everybody else is finished and that child is not, where does that child go? Or is it better to just have them start it? Really need to hammer those particulars out in that document before you leave that meeting, because they sound like nothing to us, but to a kid who's got to get up in the middle of class and walk somewhere, it's embarrassing. Or if they have to sit in the back and they can't concentrate because everybody is now talking or whatever, it's not fair to the child.
I know of a situation where they put the child in the hallway, and that may have worked when for the time when the classes were going on, but then classes were changing, and this kid's out in the hallway trying to get their extra time.
Yeah, hallway should never be a separate location. It should be, many times it's in a special education, like resource room type situation, but it can be anywhere in the school where there are, whatever the reason is for the separate location. If it's because of tics, then you got to put them somewhere separately. We sometimes use the secretary's or the guidance office conference room. There are a lot of different places you can find to put kids, but the hallway is completely inappropriate. Well, even when it's during class time, kids are going to the bathroom. It's so distracting out there. Or the teachers have their doors open. So
would you discuss a little bit on the use it or lose it theory regarding some accommodations, such as extra time. If you never take it, then it seems to, what I understand is it doesn't translate then to like special extra time for SAT.
Right. Well, the thing is, and I tell teachers this all the time, a lot of our kids get extra time because of the interference of tics, and when they have a stressful situation, the tics get worse, or their anxiety becomes worse. And so if you just take away the time limit, they may not necessarily take that extra time, but they needed it to be able to reduce the stress. And if you can make that point, you know, then they're going to keep that accommodation. I mean, I think they definitely should, because when you get to standardized tests in school, state testing, in New York we have New York State Regents exams, and you know, they get into high school, they have the SATs and all these kind of things. They really need those for those kinds of tests. And many kids who have, you know, who have extra time on their 504 or IEP rarely use it. But if they didn't have it, then we would have issues.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I think the rationale is that the stress of putting that time limit will increase the symptoms and make it impossible for that child to finish. So there's a real rationale for keeping that in place, even if they're not always using it.
Okay. Well, yeah, but as it applies to SAT, sometimes it seems like that becomes this whole other area of some difficulty if you haven't been using the extra time. So.
Exactly. But if you've got it on your 504 or IEP, then technically they have to give it to you.
Okay.
Yeah. Another thing, if anybody's interested, I have 2 SAT brochures that I wrote about how to ensure getting accommodations on these particular tests. If anyone is interested, just email me and I'll send them to you.
Oh, that would be great. Thank you for offering that.
Yeah.
We have a question from a mom with a TS diagnosis, and she has kind of a long question, but basically it is that she's saying she can't seem to convince the staff that her son's TS diagnosis is real. Now, it would seem to me if you had a medical diagnosis that you would present that to the school, but they're seeing it as behavior, and
Right.
they, you know, and that he should be able to have control over it. Could you just talk a little bit about that situation?
I get it a lot. I mean, if you've got a diagnosis from a doctor, maybe the doctor needs to use the sample letter or parts of it to make that very clear and bring up, you know, how sometimes this can look like behavior. But if you've got a medical diagnosis, no school district can go against that medical diagnosis. I mean, these are, you know, they don't have medical degrees. I certainly wouldn't say, I don't think this kid has epilepsy because I never saw them have an epileptic seizure. You know, that's ridiculous. I'm not a doctor. And teachers shouldn't be doing that, or any school personnel. The other thing that immediately comes to my mind is that if they think that it's behavioral rather than tics or, you know, related to the Tourette, they clearly need a good in-service. And that's something that the mother could get on the child's plan, whether it be a 504 or IEP, to get someone in and do a really good in-service, explaining the complex tics that often look like behaviors, you know, and explaining some of these things that can often look more like behaviors than they are symptoms of the disorder. But I mean, they have no right in any way to not agree with the medical diagnosis.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Would you? This is a tough question, and I don't. You know, we're out of time here practically. Maybe this isn't the best time, but you know that we've had a couple of questions about transitioning into college. Is there any advice here you could give that would, you know, shed a little light on some ideas for parents?
Well, it's important to start the process early. You know, a year in advance is not too early to go in, and as you're applying to schools, check into what, you know, all colleges are supposed to have some sort of program for kids with disabilities. They're never going to get an IEP per se because they don't have special ed teachers, et cetera, but they will have, definitely can get accommodations. The accommodations that they've had in all the way through school can transfer right to college, whether they're from an IEP or 504. It's very important once you decide what college you're going to get in and meet with the person who is the director of the disability services, to see what's in place, to see what the child is going to be, and one of the things that I think parents have to remember is that accommodations cannot be in college at any extra expense to them. Like one of the things that I ask for a lot for kids with Tourette and OCD is a separate room, a single room, because it's so difficult for them to have a roommate, and with all of these symptoms going on. And I've very frequently had schools who will then charge the parent $2,000 more of tuition or room and board for getting that private room. They can't do that. That is something that is at, it's not leveling the playing field if you have to pay $2,000 extra for it. So it's getting started early, checking into the disabilities departments of the different colleges, making sure. The one thing that's difficult is that once kids get into college, the kid has to become their own advocate. And a lot of times that makes it's difficult. And it takes kids sometimes a while to realize that they still need these accommodations. They have to kind of fall apart a little bit first. Some of them are really good about going in, but I go in with kids a lot of times and meet with the disabilities officer, put things in place for them. You can do presentations. It's just about anything, that you do at a public elementary, middle, or high school, you can do at the college level. But it's starting early. Definitely starting early, getting in and meeting with the appropriate personnel, educating them, giving them information, going through accommodations, what they might be facing in college that they're not facing, they didn't have to face in high school, like living accommodations, things like that. They can they'll have a resource center where the kids can go for help anytime they need. They work on executive functioning, a lot of the very similar types of things to what they would get in high school.
Okay, if you can hang on, I'm going to wrap it up with one more question, okay?
Sure.
And we've had a couple of questions kind of on this same topic. So, best approaches for a parent to deal with the school, how to approach the school is one question. Another one was, is this process as adversarial as it sounds? Talk a little bit about how to not have it come across as adversarial or being just the mom who complains all the time.
Exactly. It so much depends on not just the school but the personnel you're dealing with. I have to say that probably 70% of the schools I go into, they're not adversarial at all. Once they are educated and we can get them on board with what really this disorder is about and what they can realize this child's needs, they're very cooperative. I have some wonderful, wonderful schools that I work with all over the country. But there are times when it will become adversarial. And a lot of times it's ignorance on the part of the staff about what this disorder is. I think, I always say to parents, go in there with a smile on your face, be professional, don't walk in with a chip on your shoulder. I always, 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 bring someone with you, even if it's your sister, your aunt, your next door neighbor, and don't be afraid if the meeting starts to go downhill a little bit and things start becoming adversarial to ask to table the meeting and come back at another time. Because I'd rather just table it and get things calmed down a little bit than I would get into a big to-do, because once that happens, it's really hard to go back to that table again.
Oh, it's like letting the genie out of the bottle.
Yes.
Yeah, it's really hard.
Exactly.
Well, we have gone well over. I think I'm going to wrap it up here. Sue, as always, it was a pleasure. A really lot of great information. And I think I said this to you before. It's the best explanation of a 504 or an IEP that I've ever had, that I've ever heard. So it was really great. Thank you. Thank you very much. And everybody, stay tuned for next week. There's more good stuff coming.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining our webinar on Educational Rights Part 1, Your Child's Educational Rights and Options. There is an exit survey which we need everyone attending to fill out. The discussion board will be open and available for the next 7 days on the NJCTS website for any questions that were not covered in tonight's presentation. That website is www.njcts.org. Any questions that we didn't get to that you posted during the webinar, I will post there tomorrow, plus you can ask any additional. Also, an archived recording of tonight's webinar will be posted to the website. Our next presentation is next Wednesday, Educational Rights Part 2, Denial of Services and Discipline Issues, presented again by Sue Connors. And this ends tonight's webinar. Thank you, Ms. Connors, for your presentation, and thank you everyone for attending. Good night.
Thank you.